This is the Houndsman XP Podcast.
Good dog, get that bear. Get that bear in
The original podcast for the complete Houndsman.
Look at your coat and go, Justin Hyde! We're gonna get him! We're gonna get him!
The podcast that represents our lifestyle of extreme performance.
Get up there! Get him! Get him! Yeah! Good boy! Good boy, Ranger!
Uniting houndsmen across the globe, from east to west, north to south.
You know, if you're going to catch a cat or a lion, you know, you have to have teamwork.
We take you to the wildest places on earth.
Yeah, so how many days a week do you spend out there?
As much as I can, to be honest with you. Anytime that I get, I'm out there.
Join us for every heart-pounding adventure on Houndsman XP.
I'll tell you like I tell everyone else, I'm going to hunt whether you're here or not, so you might as well be here.
There is not a hotter topic on the interwebs than the iconic dog food question. A lot of questions out there about dog food, and there is not a hotter brand on the market for houndsmen right now than Joy Dog Food. This is not an infomercial for Joy Dog Food by any means, but we are going to tell the complete story of Joy Dog Food from its beginnings in 1945 all the way up until Wade Gratzwitz bought the brand. We are talking to Chip Kohser Sr. He was at the ground level of the development of Joy Dog Food. Why do we want to talk about Joy Dog Food? I'll tell you why I like talking about this topic. As houndsmen and a hunting community, we have to find and support brands who support us. We can't simply be in that race for the bottom, that race for the cheapest price. We can't buy into the hype. There are a lot of brands out there who will step up and put a picture of a hunting dog on their bag and then market it to the hunting public. Joy Dog Food has been instrumental in developing the lifestyle that we have right now. And you're going to hear that when Chip and I talk about the beginnings of how they mixed the original dog food, the name changes, how they got the name, how they came up with formulas. It's going to be a little bit technical in the middle, but eventually we are going to get to how important the Kohser family was and Joy Dog Food was in PKC youth programs, super stakes, you know, the very things that make our world go round are being talked about in this. You're going to be surprised. Mr. Kohser had a close personal relationship with Jarvis Umphers. And with Jarvis's recent passing, we spend some time at the end of this also to pay tribute to a true innovator in the coon hunting world. And you'll hear how Mr. Kohser describes Jarvis Umphers and how he brought coon hunting into the modern era and put us on center stage. This is an episode packed full of history. It's an episode packed full of old stories, funny stories. It's just a great episode that we get right down to business on this thing and talk about Joy Dog Food. Yes, they are a sponsor of this show, and the reason they are is because I believe in this company. They're not marketing their brand to me and then using their dollars and funneling it off to organizations and movements and things that undermine our lifestyle. Give Joy Dog Food a look. Give this podcast a listen and see if you don't agree with me that this is a brand that deserves your support. Guys, the Old South Dog Box is rocking, and we're going to get the tailgate down. It is time to dump the box. Yeah, so this studio is extremely fancy. You can give you a little virtual tour here. You got the hounds. Hey, you need to look at this pit bull. This pit bull is shiny as he can be. My wife says he's never been this shiny.
You told me she sings Joy to the World and running around the house.
That's right.
Yeah.
She's got the joy, 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 joy down in her heart. Yep. Yep. That's what she thinks.
Yeah.
No, hey, I've got the recording rolling. I smashed the button and we're going to dive right in. And I'm honored to have Chip, your dad, on here. Why don't you introduce your dad for everybody?
Well,
This will be the only time you're allowed to talk during this whole thing.
that's fine. So this is the original Chip Kohser. We used to say that the big Chip Kohser, but that got passed up about 20 years ago, I think. But this is my dad. He's the one that ran Joy for, I don't know how long, 30 years?
Yeah, somewhere around there.
And he was the one that was instrumental in really getting us involved in the hound world in the first place. So,
yeah, so we got Big Chip and we got
Little
your
Chip.
nickname
We
was
got Little Chip.
should have been Cow Chip. He's so full of shit. No, it's been a pleasure getting to know your son, Mr. Kohser. I appreciate it. And I'm going to call you Mr. Kohser so that little Chip understands who I'm talking to here, because I'll probably forget to say the big and the little part. But why don't we talk about we had Wade Grasswitz on and gave us the story of Joy Dog Food since High Standard purchased Joy, but I think there is still a lot of misconceptions and people hanging on to the Joy Dog Food of the late 90s, early 2000 era, and kind of dispel some of those rumors and talk about what happened with Joy Dog Food during that time. But let's start with your dad. Started the company in 1946. Is that correct?
1945. Actually, him and a fellow by the name of Ab Schiffler, they started it, and they were in the farm feed business originally in the 40s. And actually, their entry into the market was in the tri-state area, Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia. They had 18 or 20 feed stores, and they manufactured farm feed. And of course, they sold a full line of feed store type items to the local farmers. And the concept was, if we get the farmers coming and buying our feed, we'll keep our margins relatively slim on the feed, but then we'll get them to come back and buy their fertilizer and some of their implements and their seed and that type of thing. And the business grew from there. In 1952, 1953, they started using some common ingredients they were using in farm feeds, and actually started mixing a dog food blend with a shovel on the floor of the feed mill.
No kidding.
Put it in sacks, tied it with a miller's knot, took a grease pencil, put the name, at that time, actually, it was Skippy Dog Food, Besco and Skippy Dog Food. They'd write that with a grease pencil. And my dad had a buddy of his take a flatbed truck they had sitting around the mill, and he actually built a dog house on the back of the feed truck. Instead of having an enclosed box truck, they actually built a dog house that you could haul 3-4 ton of dog food at a time. And he went around to all these little countries. Go ahead.
Have you got a picture of that old truck anywhere?
Do you have a copy of the Joy history that we put together in 95?
No, I do not. Chip, bring that with you to the Grand American this week if you can.
I'll do that.
Yeah.
There's some photos in there. There's some other photos in there. Matter of fact, there was a time when we had the salesman running around with in old station wagons with a hand painted Joy Dog Food banner that was bolted to the top of the station wagons they ran around with. But he went around and went to the country stores. At that time, a lot of your your grocery stores. You didn't have supermarkets. You had grocery stores. He'd go around those country stores and give them a line about this dog food that they had and ask them if he could put a few bags in there. And he'd come around in a couple of weeks. And if they sold it, they could pay for it. And if they didn't sell it, he'd pick it up and carry it and get it out of their way. And so that's how it started.
I got a couple questions. So if they're mixing this on the floor of the mill with a shovel, what did the original dog food look like? Was it in nuggets like it is now, or how'd that go?
What you would have is some of it was a fine meal, very similar consistency to cornmeal. And of course, your feed mills at that time had pellet mills. And then and what the pellet was you took ingredients and it actually went through a pressed pellet mill and it produced a hard pellet. And to get your meat products, you had to use a pellet mill, obviously. And they would use rendered meat and bone meal. And they would use that in some of their chicken feeds and other animal feeds as well. Certainly the balanced nutrition wasn't what it wasn't the way it is today, or even the way it was 30 or 40 years ago. They started that. And then in turn, in the early 50s, actually, Purina developed the first extruder for dog food.
Okay.
And that an extruder produces a product similar to what you see out there today. We didn't have an extruder, but we had an apparatus called a kibbler, and you could take grain products and you could run them through there, and it would actually make it would be like a grape nut cereal, but it would be about a 1/4 inch in diameter, and you'd mix that with the meat pellet, and that was the old Joy kibble, and that's what they started out with. But in 1950, early in 54, they were selling a product for a couple years in printed bags called Skippy. General Foods at that time, and I don't know if they still do, they had a trademark Skippy for peanut butter. And they became offended that, some little upstart outfit out of Pennsylvania was using their name, and they threatened to sue Best Feeds, who was the company. And my dad and Ab Schiffler sat down, and it was going to cost them $5,000 to retain an attorney to try to fight with General Foods, and they didn't have $5,000.
Right.
So Ab Schiffler had they raised dachshunds, and he had a bitch that had produced some pretty nice pups named Joy. And so they decided one night, sitting in Ab's kitchen, actually they were using Mrs. Schiffler's stove to conjure up some dog food mixes, and they decided to change the name to Joy. And in 54, they started marketing the dog food as Joy Dog Food. And the farm feed was still the big deal at that time, not the dog food. But they were able to get this Joy Dog Food into some of the little grocery chains and that throughout the tri-state area, and then on down into Virginia, and developed it from there. For many years, the primary business was the old line country wholesalers. Once again, you didn't have very many supermarkets in the 50s, and that was their entree. They eventually hired a few guys that were salesmen, and what they would do is they'd go out, spend a week in a given territory, whether it was down around Richmond, Virginia, or it was up in New York State or even New Jersey, and they would spend a week going around to all the customers and actually writing orders. At the end, on Friday, they'd go in and turn the orders into the manager of the wholesale house, and they'd put together an order for dog food. And I've got some questions when you get a chance. So back in the old I started hunting in the early 80s and was around a lot of the old time houndsmen, and they always talked about grinding corn or going to the mill and getting dog bread. And so
was that basically the same concept that your dad and Ab Schiffler started with on the floor of that mill? Was trying to take some of that technology and build on it? Did they have other customers that were coming in and mixing dog bread and just thinking, man, we got to come up with a dog food?
Well, the one big difference was most of those guys that were mixing home gruels, if you will, or dog cookies or dog cakes or dog bread or whatever the case might be, in order to use their meats, in many cases they were getting scraps from the butcher shop.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't very stable. I mean, you had to feed it within the next few days or it would go rancid. And
Right.
obviously that wasn't good for the dog. So that became a constant thing. And a lot of those, I remember guys cooking up their home gruel in a cauldron. They'd have a pot sitting outside and they have some
Describe what was in that.
It would have meat scraps. It would have fat. Of course, you wanted fat for some energy. And in a lot of cases, they would use cornmeal.
Mm-hmm.
Once again, it all depended on what was available. In certain parts of the country, cornmeal was much more prevalent than wheat middlings or ground wheat. When you got out in the Midwest, wheat was much more prevalent than corn at that time. And they'd mix that. In some cases, they'd come up with a few vitamins that were being used for cattle or sheep or whatever the case might be, and they'd throw some of that in. And I'm sure a few of those guys, they had some secret home stuff that they'd try to mix in there, and they would try to develop a formula, but consistency wasn't there. Obviously, stability wasn't there.
Mm-hmm.
They were constantly having to cook dog food, and that was a problem they had. The one thing advantage that we had is whenever you were using meat and bone meal that was rendered, it had stabilizer on it to keep that fat from going rancid. Now, in the early days, that rancidity would be deterred for maybe a month or two. As things have developed, now you have products that are, even if it's high fat, it's stable for a couple of years. But early on, that wasn't the case. But what they were able to do is, obviously, they had ingredients available that the guy wouldn't have available on the farm or in his kennel, and they were able to blend that. And because they were buying ingredients for other purposes, they had sources that you wouldn't have if you were just doing it yourself. So
Exactly.
that's what they did. The one thing that Purina did when they come out with that extruder was you were able to take your grain type ingredients and your meat ingredients, and you were able to combine those into the same piece of dog food. And that was obviously a big advantage. You didn't have two different types of particles, because you would get some dogs that would pick out one versus the other. And actually early on, it wasn't common for dogs to ever be fed dry dog food. Number one, it wasn't very tasty. And number two is it didn't have a composition that worked well for the dogs. People used to feed their dogs, and if the dogs didn't eat it in the first 15 or 20 minutes, you pulled the pan.
Right.
Because you're worried about it going sour.
Mm-hmm.
So that technology developed in the
So from my standpoint, what I'm seeing and what I'm imagining, because all I can do is imagine this process, what you're telling me is the dog food industry developed into a consistent pellet where you're trying to get the same amount of meat base, grain base, everything into an individual kibble, so the dog can't go through and just pick out the cracklings or just whatever he's going to eat. Is that accurate?
Yes. And plus, even from the standpoint of on the manufacturing side, if you have different size pieces or different shaped pieces, you think about it and you have it in a bin and you're bringing it down to a bagger. And the same as with anything, those pieces would start separating. You get more of one or more of the other. So to get that consistency, it was much better if it was all in the same shape and the same size pellet. But in the 50s, prior to probably 1956, 1957, the highest fat dog food that was available was about 5% fat. Now, if you think about the products you have today, 5% fat
Amazing.
isn't very much. So obviously there was a lot of supplementation going on. And actually, Ab Schiffler, the guy that was in it with my dad, he did some research on the human side, and they found a product called BHA. Now, you don't use BHA today because be it real or be it fantasy, supposedly it has all kinds of health-causing gremlins. You know, if you see,
It's like GMOs.
Oh yeah, absolutely. but what that allows to do is, Joy was the first dog food to have a 7% fat product, and that was the cat's meow early on. And you're able to build from that. Obviously, you went through a bunch of different processes. The consumer need changed. Many of the houndsmen at that time were still doing supplements. As a matter of fact, to give you an example, the greyhound world, they were still using supplements in the late 90s.
And what those supplements, what they consist of?
Biggest thing would be fats and vitamins.
Mm-hmm.
And what they were trying to do is do the same thing that athletes do, is, you know, supercharge a little bit. So the dog food companies, they went through a metamorphosis, if you will, where we became very prominent in the working dog or the hunting dog world. Would have been in the early 70s. At that time, we had a product called Chunks of Joy, which was a 25% protein and 8% fat food, and that was pretty good. And we had a Joy Kibble. Yeah. We had a Joy Kibble that was a 26 and 7, and we had this product called Joy Meal that was a 26% protein and 7% fat. Initially, the push was towards protein as opposed to
I remember those days.
Towards fat. We had a sled dog customer up in New England, and that had won the world championship a couple times. And he said, "Can you do something that has a little bit more fat?"
Mm-hmm.
So we piddled around with it. And this was actually before I was involved in the company. I was still in high school, and they figured out a way to get 10% fat and have it, number one, get it consistently on the product, at the same time keep it stabilized. And that was we had a Joy Meal 7% and a 10%. The 10% was very, very minimal as far as manufacturing.
Just because there wasn't that high of a demand for it, or because
people just weren't feeding it.
And your typical houndsman at the time was more concentrating on protein than he was fat.
Right. And if you looked at the industry as a whole, what you had Purina Chow that was dog chow that was a 25 and 8. You had Wayne dog food, which was very prominent at the time. It was a 25 and 8. You had Casco dog food that was a 26 and 8. And then you had a whole bunch of other brands, but that was pretty much the high-end dog food. Casco actually came out with a Casco meal that was 10% after we had the 10% fat product, but they were actually marketing it to the houndsman. The disadvantage they had, it was still in a meal form like cornmeal, which
no kidding,
which you couldn't feed it dry very well.
Right.
So in the early 70s, we started transitioning for a time, making private label grocery product was a big part of our business. At one time, it was making up 50 or 60% of our business. And Purina Chow had gone through a process where their primary grocery product, Purina Chow, had gone from a 25% protein to a 23% protein and was now a 21% protein and 8% fat that became the standard in the grocery industry. And of course, that's what all these private label grocery outfits, they wanted their brand comparable to Purina Chow. Coincidentally, at that time, I was in high school. I was still working in our feed stores, and we handled Purina dog food. We handled Wayne dog food. And it was sort of funny in the early 70s, as Purina started reducing the nutrient content in their Purina chow, suddenly they came out with Purina puppy chow, and it was a 26% protein and 10% fat. And based on research at their research kennels and this type of thing, this was the ideal puppy food. You shouldn't be feeding that high protein, high fat food to your adult dogs. Now, of course, that gave them a product that was suitable for puppies, even though Purina chow was their benchmark product. What we did then in the mid 70s is when we really started getting involved. Our first involvement with working dogs, or competition dogs, if you will. There was obviously some coon dog business. Deer hounds down in the Carolinas was a big business for us. Some of the foxhound, the field trial foxhound people, they were involved, but we did a lot of sled dog business up in New England. And we did a lot of business with field trial beagle people at that time. That was field trial beagles was a big deal.
I think one of the things that maybe we could talk about just a little bit is the transition from, in the 1950s. What would you say the percentage of dogs were that were considered working dogs? I mean, you look at 2021, you got fat dogs laying on couches and everybody's got a dog, and none of them have a daggone job. And in 1950, did they normally keep dogs around just for pets, or did that dog need to have a job?
Well, I think the thing was, number one, we didn't even think about the people that had city dogs. Okay. Yeah. If they had city dogs, it was either a guard dog or it was just a dog running around the house. And the other thing was, you had a high percentage of dogs that weren't purebreds. There was a whole lot of mutts out there that actually, there was some mutts that turned into some pretty good hunting dogs.
Right.
Matter of fact, some of them became breeds. But in the rural areas, you had urban and you had rural. You didn't really have suburbia back then. And in the rural areas, there was always dogs. Okay. Right. Now they might be dogs that just ran around the farm. They might be dogs that they're using to work cattle or sheep with. Okay. And a lot of times those dogs just ran around. Come fall, they became hunting dogs. And of course, rabbits were prevalent at that time. Everybody grew up small game hunting. Today in many parts of the country, you'd be hard pressed to find a brush pile with a rabbit under it anywhere, and you certainly can't find any pheasant or quail.
Right.
But
what I've seen is a transition from a utilitarian use for a dog. I mean, even when I was a kid, Chip, it was a deal where we had a dog and had a farm, and we expected that dog. He lived outside and he had a job, and it didn't matter if there was a fox coming around the chicken house. That's what he was there for. If we went to the creek to run a trap line, he went with us and, kept critters at bay or whatever, I mean, that was the life that I even grew up with through the 70s and 80s. And this whole conversation leads into my next question of when did you start seeing the shift from utilitarian use of a dog to having a larger pet market in the dog food industry?
Probably more so in the separation, I believe, occurred mostly in the 60s, and actually towards the latter part of the 60s. And although some of the competition areas, especially among the beagle people, was very sophisticated even back in the late 50s and the early 60s. But once again, you were talking about guys at that time and totally different than the coon dog world. You had guys that had kennels that maybe had 20 or 30 brood bitches and 4 or 5 advertised stud dogs. And they'd raise 50, 60, 70, in some cases 100 pups a year, which is obviously different than the world that we're talking about in the coon dog world, where if a guy has 3 or 4 good gyps and a stud dog, maybe an older stud dog, and one that they feel's coming on, That's a coon dog kennel nowadays.
Right. Yeah.
People had more dogs. They had more space. They had more land to hunt on. I remember when we first started working with folks out in the Midwest, you'd go coon hunting and you'd never leave the guy's farm, even if you had a dog that covered some distance. Well, obviously that's not the case. Probably the most dramatic one, and I know it's not our primary topic today, was I remember the foxhound field trial people. They had their big championship down in Laurinburg, North Carolina every year. Well, they let 450 dogs loose off the table at the same time.
Yeah.
And one of the places where they cast dogs was Dead Dog Road, because 5 or 6 years before that, they mistimed when the train was coming through, and there was 50 dogs killed in 5 minutes because there was a pack of 200 foxhounds a quarter mile away from the railroad track that ran in front of the train.
Wow.
As it was coming down the track, because the train had been delayed an hour. And obviously that was crazy. I mean, there was guys riding horses and riding them pretty hard, just keeping up with the pack. I remember one day sitting on a hillside overlooking a cotton field, and we saw the fox come through, and here come 75 or 80 dogs on their tail, and they hadn't harvested the cotton yet.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you talk about a whirlwind. I mean, because the cotton was ready to pick.
So they weren't doing in a pen at that point in time. They were doing outside.
Yeah. There was, the pens were a new phenomena, and they were running on the outside. And here comes 80 dogs running through a 100-acre cotton field that was ready to be picked, and just cotton flying everywhere. I mean,
I bet that made them popular.
Well, one of their big issues every year was paying for damage.
Right.
At the national.
Right.
I mean,
gee whiz. but there's been a lot of changes, that's for sure. So when did Joy Dog Food realize? At what point in your business did Joy Dog Food realize that these are our people? Because one of the things that has drawn me to Joy, when I started hunting in the early '80s, Joy was still big. You would see advertisements with Joy sponsoring huge events in the magazines and different things like that. When did Joy realize that, hey, we need to take care of this market?
Mid-'70s, about 1970. I got out of school in 75.
Mm-hmm.
Got to work actively in early 76 with the dog food side of it. Initially, I worked with our grain purchasing department, trading grain, soybean, and wheat, and this type of thing, with a grain broker working through the Chicago Board of Trade. Came to work at the office, and a lot of our business at that time was that private label grocery business. And I started making some of those. My dad had developed that business. I started working with some of those people, and we had an arrangement with a couple of our biggest customers. At that time, a big customer was somebody who bought 1,000 ton. And basically the arrangement that we worked with them for a number of years, and it was successful both ways, is 4 times a year, we'll come up with a promotion that you could run in your grocery ad on Wednesdays. Back then, everything was newspaper advertising, and would work with you and would pick a product, and a size, might be a 25-pound size, might be a 5-pound size. And what we would do is we would agree that for a 30 or 40-day period of time, we would sell to them that individual item at cost. Now, they would pay our regular margins on the rest of the line, but we would do that 4 times a year. But the rest of the time, they merchandised our product like it was their own product. We made money, they made money. Well, it got to the point where there was a whole bunch of other people getting in a private label business, and everybody was cutting everybody's throat. And it got to the point where they weren't satisfied with you making money 8 months of the year and just breaking even 4 months of the year, because somebody else was willing to swoop in and give them the deal. And of course, you had a although we all had formulas, but the end result, the 21-8 product, in most cases, everybody could make a 21-8 chunk style dog food, and that's what they wanted.
Mm-hmm.
And the manufacturers would purchase the packaging. So we would buy packaging for these labels. And all of a sudden you start getting to the point where you get instructions from your customer to ship 5,000 25-pound chunk bags to another manufacturer. So we got to the point where in some cases the same bags got shipped back and forth between the same pet food manufacturer, and we weren't making any money.
Right.
And well, I was making a call on our biggest customer at that time, and I sat down with a fellow by the name of Jim Charlie, the Charlie brothers, and I said, this isn't working. Here's what we need to do. And he said, well, that's not the way it is. We're going to buy where we can buy it the cheapest.
Mm-hmm.
And he was our biggest customer. We were only doing 12,000 ton a year at the time, and he was over 1,000 ton of it. And I said, well, we're not willing to do that. And he says, well, we'll just see. I'll just call your dad. Well, we call my dad, and be it good or bad at the time, my dad said, well, if Chip feels that's right, I'm going to stick by whatever his word was. Well, less than a year later, they quit. Well, all of a sudden, they quit. Another one quit. All of a sudden, there's 30 or 40% of our business gone.
Wow.
We were still doing business with some of these old line wholesalers, and we started focusing more and more on the hounds trade. At that time, the product you were familiar with was the 26 and 10 Joy Special Meal. Came in that green and yellow bag.
Yeah, the John Deere bag.
Okay, and that was that Joy meal that we originally had developed for those sled dog guys. And we started pushing the idea of, the right balance, 26% protein, 10% fat. Mm-hmm. We started featuring that product versus the old kibble and the chunks. And we started feeding hunts and trials. Just get it out to the people. Well, it happened to be that dogs.
What do you mean by that? What do you mean? How did you feed the trials? What did that look like?
In the case of Beagle trials, it was customary when they had a trial that a dog food manufacturer would provide the food for the 4-day event. Okay, now a big Beagle trial, you could feed for 300 or 400 pound of dog food. Okay, and would make the dog food available. Then it as our popularity improved, it got to the point where we said, you know what, we aren't going to beat our head against the wall and have 4 or 5 other dog food manufacturers in there. If you want us to take care of your trial, and at that time we were also providing all of their printed supplies. In their case, it was their judges' books and their field trial, what they called their brace books and their heat sheets and all this type of stuff. Mm-hmm. And we said, if you want us providing all this stuff, we'll do it for free. But we don't want anybody else's food on the grounds during the event.
Right.
And some people squawked about it and some people didn't squawk about it. Well, finally got to the point where if it was an event that we weren't feeding because of the popularity of our product, the only other product at that time that was in the same category nutrition-wise was Purina High Pro, that was considerably more expensive. Mm-hmm. And that old Casco meal, which wasn't very good if you wanted to do anything but feed it wet. And it got to the point where a lot of the prominent people, if Joy wasn't feeding the event, they started buying Joy and carrying it with them. And obviously that had a positive effect on the other people that experienced that. And that's where it developed. And initially it was a lot with the Beagle people, and then it would spin off because our business at that time was pretty much relegated to the East Coast. If we wanted to go west, we had to ship by rail. And that's obviously a much bigger inconvenience than shipping by truck.
So the business model was, let's get into these events, these competition events, let these guys see how their hounds perform on it. And then after they leave, they find Joy and they become a Joy customer.
Right. Up until that time, the focus was on the supply side Find the wholesale house, find the retailer, and push the product in front of the customers, and hopefully they pick it up and they like it. By starting to work with events, be it beagles or coon dogs or whatever the case might be, our focus then was we're going to create the demand, and hopefully we can find somebody that's close enough to them where they can get the dog food. So we took some of those old line wholesalers and we made them distributors. And in exchange for distribution is then, at that time, we gave them a protected territory. I still have a map here that has, I don't know, 30 or 40 states on it. We were distributing at the time that actually had lines on the map.
Yeah.
And in exchange for us giving them protection, they didn't cross the line. No,
right.
It was crazy. I mean, there was, you talk about trying to police this thing. There was times when you had a couple of aggressive distributors, and they'd have a feed store on one side of a county road, because the county road was a line, selling 4 or 5 tons of dog food every month. And on the other side of the road, there was an old country gas and grocery store selling 4 or 5 tons of Joy dog food, but they didn't cross that road, even though
you guys were like the godfathers of dog food. Everybody had to stand their territories and all that sort of stuff.
But what that did is that developed an opportunity for guys to get in the dog food business that would have never been in the dog food business.
Yeah, right.
You know, the biggest customer we ever had during my time was a guy down in eastern North Carolina by the name of Donald Warren that sold a few coon dog supplies and deer hound supplies.
Donald's still a dealer today.
Yeah, he's a dealer today. Donald went from buying 5 tons of dog food, putting it in his shed, to at one point he sold 2,800 tons of dog food in 1 year.
Wow.
So you'd find a guy like that from the PKC side in the 80s. Nick DiGiacomo, who was a director with Jarvis early on. Nick DiGiacomo was retired from the Air Force.
Mm-hmm.
And he had access to a building. And him and my dad were talking one day, and we had guys out in Oklahoma, at that time mostly coon hunt guys, that wanted Joy dog food. Well, shoot, the closest thing we had was Tennessee.
Yeah.
And Nick says, how are we going to get dog food? And Dad said, well, you know what, Nick, you got plenty of money. You're retired from the military and your wife works. Why don't you just buy a trailer load of dog food? So we shipped them a trailer load of dog food. And 1 year, Nick sold 700 or 800 tons of dog food. Bill Lukey down in Texas, it was the same thing. We didn't have any distribution in Texas. But we went out and we bought the permits for our truck so we could deliver to Texas. And eventually we were going as far as New Mexico, delivering out of Pittsburgh.
No kidding.
And running our own trucks. You didn't do it with a common carrier because, once again, and this was probably a mistake that I made, is you didn't want any outside forces having control of your product.
Mm-hmm.
So we ran our own trucks. One time our trucks were running, I don't know, we had 15 trucks, each of them running over 100,000 mile a year, doing nothing but delivering Joy dog food. And we were running 35 states.
Yeah.
And and many of these guys, North Carolina 1 year, we had 5 distributors. We sold 11,000 tons of dog food in the state of North Carolina 1 year.
What year would that have been? Early 80s? General?
No, that would have been mid-90s. That would have been mid-90s. So what you did is you developed a framework where a guy could become a dog food distributor. In some cases, a pretty good sized business. In many cases, they didn't have any business background. They didn't have a business relationship. Would sit down with them and come up with a plan for them to go to the bank to borrow the money to come up with the first $8,000 they needed for a trailer load of dog food. And it grew from there. We first got involved to any serious degree with the coon dog world, probably as far as big events, probably the Grand American was the first good size event, and we're still involved today. And obviously, we don't do that exclusively. That was UKC, and Purina owned UKC at that time,
right?
UKC owned Purina, if you will. That was a tough world for us to get into. And when we first got involved with PKC, we only had one distributor in Eastern Kentucky, and we only had one distributor in Central Tennessee. We had none in Mississippi. We had nothing beyond that area. And of course, we know that's PKC's world down there. It wasn't Michigan and Pennsylvania and New York. That was UKC world. And I believe our first serious involvement in the Midwest was probably with the old ACHA.
Before we get to all of that, I want to get to that part too. But one of the main questions, or one of the main comments I see when somebody goes on social media and asks about Joy dog food, you commonly see people say, yeah, I fed it back in the early 90s, and then something happened to it, and they either couldn't get it or the quality went down in around the year 2000 or so, and it kind of fell off the radar for Houndsman. What happened to Joy dog food during that time?
My mistake.
I wasn't trying to call you out. I just
it was absolutely my mistake. I was making the calls, and we had products that we knew that worked. Okay. Probably the biggest thing that kicked that was whenever all of a sudden you had the emergence of a 26% protein, 18% fat product. And that would have been Diamond. Okay. And then you had some other manufacturers pick up the same mantra. At that time, from a nutrition standpoint and a formula standpoint, I had some legitimate concerns about how we could get to a 26% protein. If you use too much meat as your protein source, it had some problems. Okay. And the big thing was with meat and bone meal, because you got bone along with it. If you got too much bone, your calcium phosphorus ratio got out of whack. And if your calcium and phosphorus ratio was out of whack, the body couldn't absorb the full menu of nutrients, if you will. We had a product called Joy High Pro at that time, which was a 24 and 18. And we still had the special meal, 2610. People used that. But our answer to Diamond was what we call Joy High Protein or High Performance. And it was a 24 and 18. I still believe to this day, from an available nutrition standpoint, what a dog could get, they could get more out of that than they did the competitors 26 and 18. But the popularity with the hunting dog people became the numbers. They wanted that high. They wanted that higher fat and the higher protein.
Let's talk about those higher numbers, because that's what you always see whenever the dog food conversation comes up. Automatically, and I think a lot of it is just listening to chatter. All of a sudden, when you start talking about dog food, people become nutrition experts, but the only thing they can talk about is the numbers. 26-18, this is 24-20, this is 32-32, blah, blah, blah. But from what I'm hearing what I'm hearing you say is when you get into that 26% protein in those days, you were looking at absorption rates for the actual nutrients, and the type of protein you were using, you were getting undigestible protein at that time. Is that accurate? Right.
And part of the misconception was that a dog couldn't digest vegetable protein. Now, the one thing that we used more so than most of the competitors was corn gluten meal. Corn gluten meal is what's the byproduct after you draw off the cornstarch, and that corn oil is much more valuable than the byproduct. Corn gluten meal was 93% digestible. It was more digestible than meat and bone meal. And matter of fact, In the old days, the Joy Special Meal had sort of a goldish brown color, where a lot of the competitors was more of a brown color. Well,
Right.
where that gold color came from was the corn gluten meal. Actually, it was the same thing Purdue did whenever they came out and they started marketing chickens with yellow flesh. They tried to tell you it came from marigolds or it came from chrysanthemums. Sorry, I have trouble with that word. But the reality was they were using corn gluten meal because it would actually turn the flesh yellow.
Right. The fat was yellow. I remember the yellow fat days.
Yeah.
In chicken.
And matter of fact, we experimented with some catfish foods when we had the Missouri plant. Great catfish foods, great yield, great weight gain. And all of a sudden they'd process the catfish and they couldn't sell it because it had yellow flesh, because we were using corn gluten meal. People didn't want yellow catfish fillets.
Yeah.
But so that was a mistake I made, even though I felt we were sacrificing a little bit nutrition wise. I probably should have developed a particular product, not necessarily the full line, chasing those numbers. And part of it, I think, maybe had to do with being in it for a while. I remember when people were blasting us because we had a 10% fat product instead of 7, because it'd say it makes the dogs too hot. You'll get hot spots. Okay. I mean, that was a big thing that we had to fight with the 10% fat special meal. Mm-hmm. In many cases, it's going to cause hot spots. Well, the reality is hot spots don't come from the dog food. Good dog food will help you repair a hot spot or help prevent it. But in most cases, it's going to come from a flea bite and the dog trying to chase the flea around its body. But that was a mistake I made. Now, as we got closer to 2000 and we developed what we called the Joy High Energy, which was a 24-20, we lowered the protein to 24. Mm-hmm. That kept us okay in my mind from the standpoint of where we were at as far as the amount of meat that you had to use. The other thing is the ability to stabilize fat, and the quality of fat had improved to where you could do it. Plus the other thing is early on, it was pretty hard to get more than 10 or 12% fat on the product, because part of it goes on. About 5 or 6% is internal in the product. Mm-hmm. The rest of it has to be sprayed on it. Well, right. as it's going through a web belt in a sprayer, when you think about it, it goes through a tumbler, the more fat you're putting on, more product per minute's going through, the more fat per minute's going through. Right. And as soon as fat gets cool, it starts building up. Okay. Right. And it clogged up your equipment. I mean, when we first started making 20% fat food, we had certain bins that we couldn't use because you couldn't get the product out of the bins.
Just greasy.
Yeah.
If it solidified again.
Yeah. If it wasn't a free falling bin where it came right smack dab out of the bottom, if it had an angle to it, that fat would build up and you'd spend more time cleaning out the pipes than you did packing the dog food.
Wow.
So that was a mistake that I made. At the same time, the distributor network had evolved to the point where their customer base was not exclusive to the working dog world. Mm-hmm. They had broadened their availability of product. We had a product called Joy Maintenance. Okay, and there's still a lot of it sold today, and it went through a metamorphosis. It went from a 21.6. Once again, they wanted a low-end product to go along with their quote-unquote good dog foods, okay? And a lot of the country stores, and matter of fact, that guy in Eastern North Carolina, he'd put pallets of it in the Food Lions. You couldn't get into Food Lion without paying for the slot. Well, he'd go into a Food Lion store and say, you know what? You need to have this product. And they'd say, no, we don't. Well, he'd park the truck in the parking lot and sell 8 or 10 ton of dog food in the parking lot on a weekend. And all of a sudden the customers are telling that store manager, you know what? I'd rather get Joy dog food in my shopping cart. So they'd let them put a pallet right by the cash register.
Yeah, I don't want to wait until next month when the Joy Dog Food truck's back. Go ahead and get that in here all the time.
Yeah, he might not be here next month, whatever the case might be. So that group of customers push towards that type of product. To a certain degree, their focus then became a higher volume market. And once again, your working dog market was not as high a volume market as, for lack of a better term, the semi-working pet market, if you will. Okay.
Right. Sure. Well, I can remember the day we had golden retrievers later on, and well, I guess we had them pretty much the whole time. We had a couple there, but it was unheard of there's no way my dad would have paid $30 for a bag of dog food in 1980 to feed his dog. And what we see now is the marketing side of the dog food, where people with dogs that have no job, they're not even breeding stock, they're just a fur baby, and people are paying $80 a bag for 40 pounds of dog food from Chewy because that's where the market is. So when we see that transition away from the working dog world, how did that affect you?
Well, I think the other thing that happened was people with the working dogs, the guy that used to keep 15 or 20 coon dogs around, now had 5.
Right.
Think about the typical guy in the 80s and 90s in the PKC world, let's say. If that guy was not cotton pups, if that guy was keeping more than 4 or 5 adult dogs at home, that was typical. You didn't have guys with 20 or 30 or 40 dogs. So obviously their concern in some cases was their involvement with a dog sport was a hobby in most cases. Some guys made a big living out of it. Most guys, it was a hobby. So it was coming out of their recreation dollar. Okay, so if he had 5 dogs instead of 15 dogs, he could afford to pay more for a bag of dog food and not spend any more money.
Right.
So that transition happened. The other thing that's happened with dog food is you've got, just as you do with human food and everything else, you got so much BS out there when it comes to dog nutrition.
Right.
Whenever we first started in it, dog nutrition was an unknown. There had been, most of the studies had been done with chickens and hogs, not dogs.
I read something the other day that said that dog food is more highly regulated by the FDA than human food is now. When did the FDA regulations start to affect dog food production? I
was actually on the board of the Pet Food Institute, which was the national organization when FDA first got involved. And they had through APHIS, which is the agricultural regulating arm, if you will. And APHIS had individual state departments. Okay. And they would be the ones that would test the formulas on dog food and this type. I'm sorry, not test the formulas, test the analysis. Their purpose was analysis. But then FDA basically strong-armed APHIS to become involved. And all of a sudden you became involved. And although FDA was not regulating dog food, they were starting to regulate the ingredients. A lot of the ingredients were becoming ingredients that were shared by the human food side. So that was FDA's angle to get their nose into our business.
I'm from the government and I'm here to help.
Right. Instead of dog food now being an agricultural product, it was becoming a food product. As a matter of fact,
what year was that roughly?
Early 90s.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, at that time, I got criticism from some people because I still referred to our product as feeding dogs. Okay, and I was chastised in some cases. We don't make dog feed; we make dog food.
Oh,
Okay.
you feed cattle feed, and hog feed, and
exactly
chicken
right.
feed. But our
Exactly.
dogs eat food.
Yep. They need food, and so what they did is they started getting their nose in to the state level and putting pressure on the manufacturers. So all of a sudden, one of the big things was relative to meat products. It was common practice, and I still say that it's safe. And some people would argue with me, but my son gets his ability to argue probably from me, so we'll have that debate. Is if you have a cow that dies during calf birth, okay, that was considered a downer. Okay, you either if you took it to a rendering plant, or the rendering plant picked it up, they skinned it, they sold the hides, they ground up. In this case, they took the guts out, or at the very least, they slashed it and they flushed everything out. They flushed the blood out, and they would grind that, and then they would render it into meat and bone meal. Well, today, probably very few manufacturers are using a meat meal or a meat and bone meal that comes from dead stock.
Right.
It's virtually all coming from human scrap side. So obviously those costs go up. They forget about the fact that downer cow that they rendered, they're getting the high grade fat that's coming off it. That's going into cosmetics. Okay.
Yeah.
All types of stuff that people were using to make themselves beautiful and healthy was coming from that same dead cow. You had the phenomena for a while that people said, we had people used to criticize us as, that dog food plant, they're killing horses. Well, the reality was horse meat's pretty good quality food for dogs. But horse meat in the United States after about 1960 was extremely expensive because people weren't killing horses. Okay. Right. And that was the last thing you used, because if you wanted horse meat for any reason, it was 3 times as expensive as beef. Then you had the thing where, if you remember, the mad cow disease.
Oh yeah. Okay? Yeah. Well, I think a lot of the perception around downers is there was something wrong with that cow. So, we can't dare feed our dogs that sort of thing. I wouldn't eat it, so I'm not going to allow my dog to eat it. And I think it's just something that we've seen in our culture with our dogs, getting away from that utilitarian use of a dog. And honestly, I can tell you that these 2 dogs laying on the couch behind me right here don't need a high performance dog food. They simply don't. They need the nutrition to be active and stay alive and be healthy. But to think that I need to feed them a premium dog food to achieve that, I think we've been duped by the pet food market and marketing and different things like that in these days. So Chip, I'm going to start feeding them a different dog food.
Well, and the reality is, if you're feeding them the same dog food that a high performance working dog needs, you probably can't feed that dog little enough to keep that dog from being a pain in the neck.
Exactly.
Arguing that they're hungry all the time. Okay. Because there's still something to be said for an animal as well as people, from the standpoint of the satisfaction side, that, okay, I feel like my stomach's okay. I've got something in it. But you think about it. If you have a 60-pound dog and you're feeding top of the line performance food, you probably ought to be feeding maybe a cup a day.
Right.
That dog is not going to be happy eating a cup a day.
That's exactly right. I tell my wife all the time her pit bull's fat. And of course, modern vets will look at them and say, oh, their weight is really good. I really like it. Well, they're used to seeing obese people come in with obese dogs into their pet veterinary clinic, and they're just used to looking at it. It's like we've looked at it so often that now it's normal, and we've got away from the the body condition indexes and things to really judge the condition of a dog. Hey, I have got to move on to.
Okay.
I really want to talk. Jerry Mull told me one time that if it was not for you, Chip Kohser, that there would be no PKC youth program. So I think that's a good place to dive into how Joy Dog Food has supported houndsmen and hound competition and youth programs and all sorts of things. And I also want to talk about Jarvis Umphers. Jarvis just passed. And you had a very good relationship with Jarvis for a number of years. And I want to touch on that for our listeners. I'm the type of person that I don't care if Diamond or Purina or whoever is making the best dog food. If they are not supporting my lifestyle, then I'm not going to support them. If they're not supporting me as a houndsman, then I'm not going to support them. So does that make sense?
No, it absolutely does. And actually that was something that we probably banked on. If this is something where we want to do something together, and the Houndsman or the Houndsman group provides one piece of that, and if in fact we as a vendor to them, if you will, or to their members, can supply another piece of it, then do we both get everything we want? Probably not. But if we both get what we need, that's a win. You know, which it's a mutual
loyalty.
Yeah, it's of mutual benefit. And the reality is, I think it's in any other type of deal, is if both sides don't come away from it satisfied, it was not a good deal. Both sides of an equation has to feel like their needs were met. And the one thing that we did when we first got involved seriously with Coon Dog World, like I said early on, we were involved with, the Grand American and the old ACHA. I remember whenever Purina come in and bought the ACHA registry, I was at the meeting. Okay, and Purina was making a big deal. They wanted control of this. Well, what they didn't know whenever they got the registry is old Clovis had a 4-drawer file cabinet, and that was the ACHA registry, and that's all they got for their big dollars that came from New York.
Good for Clovis.
you remember Clovis, okay? And we're sitting there in the meeting, and my dad and I are sitting there, and of course we knew Clovis and the other guys, and we knew how we operated, and they're making this big pitch with, the New York slicks come in from AKC. Well, actually, it was AKC, not Purina. I apologize. Okay. AKC wanted that registry, and they're dickering back and forth, and we're sitting there smiling at each other, and Clovis looks over and winks. We knew what he had. He knew what he had. They didn't know what he had. So they were dealing with an unknown, and the old boys that were directors of ACHA, they might have made out okay. And I guess AKC thought that they got a good deal. But I think from that, and I don't know when my dad first interacted with Jarvis. I'm guessing it was probably maybe the ACHA World Hunt, the Little World Hunt, one of those events. My dad died in 95. He was active in the business until 93. And probably for the 7 or 8 years prior to that, my dad spent cumulatively probably 8 or 9 months a year on the road. Okay. And for many years, my stepmom, Judy, traveled with him. And what he did is he went from event to event to event to event to event. And it might be something as big as the Grand American, or it might be as big as the old ACHA Little World Hunt, or it might be a bird dog sanction trial where there was 15 entries.
Right.
But he was someplace. I mean, there was times when we go 2 or 3 weeks, I didn't even know where he was at.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, I finally got to the point where, as business changes and prices change, I finally got to the point I wouldn't let him carry a price list because he'd be out out of contact for so long, he'd be quoting prices to somebody, and it wasn't the current price list. He might be a couple price lists behind. He'd get somebody like Nick DiGiacomo and tell him he could get a trailer load of dog food delivered for $8,000. Well, guess what? That was 6 months ago. It's $8,500 now.
Right.
Okay, and Nick's upset with me because I just jacked his price $500 on 20 ton of dog food. Okay.
Right.
So I finally told Dad, I said, don't make me and you both look bad. I said, don't quote prices anymore. I said, just deal with people. And that was the key of our involvement, was a relationship early on that he built with people.
Mm-hmm.
They felt he was honest. He was certainly upfront with what he thought was right and wrong. He wasn't afraid to say he was wrong. He wasn't afraid to say he was sorry.
Yeah.
And at least to that type of person, that was real important. And I think our involvement in money cases with the coon dog world was because they were our kind of people.
I think that's still true today. I think houndsmen out here want to deal with people that they trust, people that are going to tell them the truth, going to honor their word, people that are humble, but also have high integrity. And I think that is what is still making a mark in dog food companies now. If I go and order off a Chewy and I order a bag of dog food from, I'm not going to name a name, I guess, but if I order, one of the common brands that I see thrown around, what I don't know is, where is my money going? Where are their loyalties? Where are those things going? And that's why I've been so excited, and I've pursued Joy so hard to be our sponsor here, is to get that message out there. But so tell us the story. I think one of the things that people may not realize about Joy, how did you get involved in the youth programs, the PKC youth programs?
We felt it was safe. And I'll tell you why I say that. If you were dealing with, how do I want to say it, the keen competitors, the big boys, okay, or the ones that were extremely successful. We actually learned our lesson early on. If you remember, we used to advertise in all of the working dog magazines, okay. Right. And one of the things we did for a number of years, we would feature individuals, and it wasn't individuals that we went to and says, let us run an ad with you and your dog in it, and we'll feed your dogs. In absolutely no case was it ever a situation where we paid $1 for somebody to be in a Joy ad. Mm-hmm. Not one case did we ever feed their dogs in advance of them saying that they preferred Joy dog food. It was people that fed Joy dog food had reached a level of notoriety, if you will, where they would be a recognized name, or as we know in the Hound world, you don't have to remember the man's name, you remember his dog's name, and he's happy.
Right.
And that was fortunate for me because I was terrible with people's names, but I could always remember the dog's name. So we ran those ads, and then we get some backlash because you always find somebody out there that found out that this guy, or felt, whether it was real or not, that this guy had skinned him on a deal with a dog, or the judge was on his side on a cast and didn't pay attention to my call, or whatever the case might be. So after 2 or 3 years of doing that, it got our name in front of folks. They started talking about Joy dog food, but in some case, we were being accused of not being totally
picking favorites,
reliable, because we were picking favorites, and obviously we must be doing something for them, and they weren't necessarily their most favored competitor. So we backed off of that, and not just with the coon dog world, but to a major part with coon dog world, we said, if we can focus on the kids, that takes away some of that junk.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. You and I might be fierce adult competitors, and we might try to run each other into the ground when we have a chance. But if our kids are out there on a cast, I'm going to help your kid, and you're going to help my kid. So that's how that came about. And I don't, quite honestly, I'm sure with Jarvis, we know that he was the P.T. Barnum of coon dog world. Okay. So I'm sure he was looking for some type of something to promote, because that was Jarvis's lifeblood. And whether I'm sure he suggested that we do something with PKC. And my dad's response was, if we're going to do something with PKC, we're going to do it with the kids.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean,
and that's how the relationship started with PKC. Was through the youth program.
Actually, before that, my first involvement was whenever they had the national, of course, PCA, the national championship was a much bigger deal than the World Hunt early on. And I remember being in, I guess it was Effingham, maybe, where they had their first national championship, and they were under a circus tent. Okay. Up in Illinois. And that was the first time I was there. It was myself. It was my dad, my stepmom, Judy, Mike Harper, who was very involved, Lester Walker, who was a salesman we had from Kentucky that was very involved. And matter of fact, I remember the night there's a whole bunch of people in that tent, and a mama skunk and her litter of little ones come traipsing through the middle of the tent, and you had a couple hundred people scurrying for the exit. But during that time is the idea of a youth hunt was born. Initially, as you may well know, the kids had to compete in regional qualifiers. There was only 12 kids eligible for the Joy Youth Hunt.
Okay.
But the kids participated in qualifiers. Well, all of a sudden, that got adults involved with getting kids involved in competition coon hunting.
Right.
And there was 10 or 12 or 15 regional events throughout innumerable states. If a kid had to win a regional to be eligible, originally it was the first time there was only 12 kids.
What year would that have been? Yeah.
Probably mid 80s.
Mm-hmm.
I could probably find some old PKC magazines back there and see what the date was. Mike Creasy won the first one. Mike Creasy, now he's a big shot county commissioner or something up in Kentucky. He won the first one, and that was, and the deal was there. We put up X number of dollars every year. Jarvis put it in a separate account, and it was held until those kids had a need for it whenever they went to college, and they had to use it either for college or trade school or something of that nature. It wasn't they didn't get the money.
It wasn't a blank check. It wasn't just a handed over check. It went into a trust fund or a scholarship fund.
And actually, at least early on, the checks that PKC wrote out of that account went to the school. It did not. It never went to the kid or went to their parents. It went directly to the school.
Wow.
Some of, like I said, it could be the trade school, could be college, whatever the case might be. I know Chip ran into one of the kids, Duran Link, that won multiple times a few months ago, and Duran says, Joy Dog Food paid for my college.
Wow.
Now, he was successful more than 1 year. And then it morphed to the point where it got bigger and bigger, and there was years when we had 30 or 40 or 50 kids. If you think about some of those pictures that appeared in Pro Hunt with Mike Harper and myself, I mean, the whole matter of fact, would order 4 or 5 dozen jackets just so the kids all had a Joy jacket on.
Yeah.
And if it was a kid that was relatively good size, he had to hide it from his dad, or his dad would take his jacket from him.
I actually was able to fit in Duran's shirt jacket from whenever Duran was a kid, and I'm not a little guy.
but it was all about the kids when they went, and of course that all happened at Aurora. Actually, I think early on, the first year it was not at Aurora, it might have been at Mayfield. But Aurora was whenever the thing really expanded with a bunch of kids. We took them to a place called Willow Pond every year for a luncheon, and it was for us and the kids. The parents could come if they want, but the focus was the kids. And every year we would have somebody, some adult, for lack of a better term, make a pitch to these kids about life lessons, not about coon hunting,
Right.
and not about anything else. It was about life lessons, and that was important. And I think you talk about our involvement with PKC. I think dealing with people that you're comfortable with. I remember my dad telling me one year after the World Hunt, and it was a year I couldn't be there. And one of the things that impressed him most was that Jarvis asked him to say the prayer at the opening of the World Hunt.
Yeah. Yeah. Says a lot about your dad's character right there. So he's a guy that was trusted. He was a guy that was involved. He was a guy that cared, and people saw that and wanted to support Joy Dog Food.
Yeah, I guarantee you there was people that fed Joy Dog Food that didn't think it was the best dog food. Now, many of them gave us feedback that we developed some more formulas that was to more of their liking. You know, Joy Super Meal and Joy High Energy, and some of those things that came about not so much from a nutritionist conjuring it up in a lab, but from
real feedback.
But customers that we trusted.
Right.
Okay. And you'd make up 4 or 5 ton of it, and you'd put it out 500 pound at a time to a half a dozen people that you trust and say, tell me what you think.
Okay.
Yeah. Feed this compared to the Diamond. Feed this compared to one of our other formulas. Tell us what you think. And it was people you knew was going to give you honest feedback, and you weren't hearing it from a research kennel somewhere with a bunch of people with white coats. You were hearing it from people with dog crap on their feet.
Right.
And you knew it was real.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that allowed us to better suit our products to the people we were trying to appeal to.
Yeah. So what other programs did you get involved with at PKC?
Well, once again, Jarvis being the PT Barnum, always was working for another angle when he came up with this thing called Super Steaks. Okay. And at that time, my dad was somewhat involved, but basically told Jarvis, he said, if you want to put something together like that, he says, I'll concentrate on the kids, but if you want something beyond that, you need to talk to Chip and Mike Harper. And so I was working with Mike in West Tennessee, calling on some customers, and we agreed to go down to Jarvis's place in Myrtle, Mississippi, and sit down and talk about some bright ideas that he had. And once again, I love Jarvis, and I appreciated Jarvis, and I respected Jarvis. But Jarvis always had one more thing that he was wanting to throw in the hat. And if you'd bite it, Jarvis was real happy to feed it to you, okay? And matter of fact, I remember saying to Mike, what's Jarvis really up to? And he said, Chip, I honestly don't know. And I said, well, let's go down and visit with him, and let's see what he has in mind. Well, on the way down there, number one, we got caught in a storm. Number two, we got hung up at a customer, and it was a good customer, so we had to spend the time that he wanted to spend with us. So we headed out from Memphis at about probably 9:30 at night. We just got across the Mississippi line, and Harper was doing probably 90 and a 55. And, of course, a blue light comes up behind us. And a big old trooper from Mississippi comes and walks up to the door and taps on the window and says, you know why I pulled you over? And Harper, if you were ever around him, the typical West Tennessee accent, you could only half understand him. I finally got to the point after working for me for about 8 years, I could actually understand what he said. Matter of fact, he would give speeches sometimes at PKC. And somebody like Roy Trumbull would turn around to me and say, "What in the world did he say?" Yeah. So anyhow, he's mumbling back and forth with this big old cop from Mississippi. And finally, Mike pulls out his license and his registration, and found out his registration had run out 6 months before. So now we're in a big world of hurt. So they talked for a little bit longer. And finally, I said to the trooper, I said, we're not trying to avoid anything. If there's a ticket involved, so be it. He said, well, where are you going this time of night? We're going to Myrtle, Mississippi. We're going down there to meet with a guy that's involved with coon dogs. Well, it turns out his daddy had coon dogs, and that conversation went on for another 15 or 20 minutes. Well, finally, we left with Mike getting a warning and a promise that he would send in his registration on the truck as soon as he got home. So we get to Jarvis's about 11:30 at night.
Mm-hmm.
Joyce had planned on cooking us a steak dinner, so obviously we took time to eat a steak dinner before Jarvis made his pitch. We got to talking, and at that time, they were doing this Super Stakes pup hunt. It was in its infancy. And Jarvis says he wanted to do something to push the pup side of that. And it finally settled out that what they were going to do is they were going to have a pup of the month based on whatever points they earned during that month. They would publish it. In those 12 pup of the months, they would be eligible for a hunt. And he had decided that he had made some type of arrangements with Lady Luck Casino that it would be held at the casino. And he felt, well, that would be a good draw because the guys would bring their wives because their wives would want to go shopping and they'd want to be go play the slot machines or whatever. And he says, but I need sponsorship. And I said, Jarvis, you've got all kind of money coming from the Super Stakes stuff. Why don't you just reach into your pocket and pull some out? He said, obviously that money coming in had already been spent, I'm sure. And he said, well, we need to do something. And, we don't need to do something for all of them because there's some prestige involved. But, maybe we can do final cast or we may do cast winners. And I said, Jarvis, that's going to be too complicated. I said, if I'm involved in it, I said, I'm going to have to keep track of it. And I said, how many places you paid on or how many cast winners you paid on? I says, people are going to come up to me and say, why did you do it that way? And I says, and I'm not going to have a clue. I'm going to have to say, well, that was one of Jarvis's deals. So why don't we just make it simple? I says, we'll just make it winner takes all. He says, well, we don't do winner takes all. And I says, if you want me to pay for it, we're going to do winner takes all.
More entry fees back in then, by the way.
Right.
Oh,
right.
I don't know, a couple $100. Well, there was no entry fee for that.
Okay.
There was no entry fee for that.
He's already qualified.
They had already qualified, but I think the World Hunt at that time was only $250, maybe. I don't know what it is today.
Of course, I think it's $330 or $350 somewhere on in there. I haven't hunted it for a couple of years.
And of course, they had some free passes, but a guy could always buy back in if he lost his cap and whatever. But so I said, money has a tendency to take this thing, and I says, and money doesn't give me a whole lot of exposure. I said, these guys all drive 4-wheel drive pickups. Or if they don't have a 4-wheel drive, they're driving 2-wheel drive out in the country. They wish they had a 4-wheel drive and they're finding a buddy to ride with. I says, why don't we just give away a truck? Well, Jarvis really liked the money side of it more. And we went back and forth and back and forth. As Jarvis and I did many times for many years. Like I said, I loved him like a brother. But there was times when we argued like brothers too. And so finally he said, okay, if that's what you want to do, that's what we'll do. And that's what started the truck hunt.
The truck hunt.
And that was a big, from a marketing standpoint. I mean, here's a truck that's on the front of the magazine.
Nobody had ever done it before.
No. And it wasn't a lease. As a matter of fact, once again, how things get somewhat to the point where you scratch your head. Harper knew a guy who knew a guy who knew a guy who had a dealership. And, part of the thing was the very first year, they actually had one of their salesmen bring the truck down.
Yeah.
Well, after that, we developed a good enough relationship that they handed Harper an open title. No plates. He'd pick the truck up somewhere in Kentucky. Would drive it to Lady Luck. No plates, an open title, no registration.
And this all came out of getting stopped by a trooper to begin with.
Yeah. Yeah, because we actually finalized the plan at about 2:30 in the morning.
Yeah.
And Joyce is telling Jarvis we need to go to bed, and Jarvis said we ain't done talking yet.
So the birth of the truck hunt happened at Jarvis's table, and Joy Dog Food bought the truck.
Absolutely. And then of course a couple years later it grew to the point where they had the handler of the month.
Yeah.
And then we did that.
Then it just became known as the truck hunt. You're running for a truck ticket. What you guys did changed the culture. Nobody had ever done that before, put up a truck for that. So even today, you've still got people that are running these open events, running for a truck ticket, going to, Lula, Mississippi and hunting for the truck. And it's still very prestigious. And to think that it all started around Jarvis's table. You've said it a couple times. You said Jarvis was a P.T. Barnum of coon hunting. And I'm sure you're saying that as a term of admiration.
Absolutely.
But one of the things I want to cover is, let's spend about 5 minutes here and just talk about Jarvis and what he did for competition coon hunting and the impact that he had and what his life meant to the modern day coon hunter in 2021.
In my opinion, Jarvis took it to the next level, where the coon hunting world now had not 2 or 3 major events that drew people's attention, whether they were able to participate or not. But all of a sudden, you've got some podunk hunt somewhere that's got a $10,000 or $15,000 purse. Okay, Those things all were, in my opinion, were end result of this brainchild that was originally Jarvis's. And early on, there was a lot of criticism from the other organizations that PKC was all about money. It wasn't It wasn't about coon hunting, and I'm sure some of them are still singing that same song today.
Still goes around today.
And from my view, and I had the opportunity to not be intimately inside what was going on at PKC, but I was close enough to it that there wasn't the chicanery that PKC was oftentimes accused of by the other organizations. It was run pretty straight, and there was times when there was modifications that were or were not graciously accepted by everybody. But in many of those cases, I think they were changed as it was absolutely necessary for PKC to survive. Jarvis didn't become a billionaire because of his involvement in PKC. I think he and Joyce probably could enjoy a good steak once or twice a week, but that's about the extent that it got to.
Right.
And then you went through the evolution where Larry got involved. And Larry, the last thing he needed was PKC. But that was a necessary step, and now RD having, and RD was there early on, obviously with Jarvis. I mean, that's been his life for 30 years or more. But I think when it came to the competition coon dog world, Jarvis created it started in its infancy, the phenomena that PKC has become today. Obviously, it's gone through metamorphosis a couple times, but I'm not real close to it, obviously, today, but I don't think PKC or that whole coon dog competition world would be accurately described the way it is today if you wouldn't have had Jarvis Umphers or somebody like Jarvis Umphers to basically create the brainchild that it grew into.
I know modern day PKC hunters, and this was all started with the pioneering efforts of Jarvis here, but they hang their hat on that. PKC stands for Professional Kennel Club.
Yeah.
You're talking about guys who, I mean, we got guys now that are bringing home $200,000 a year as handlers. We've got dog prices that are unimaginable, especially in the 1950s, but even from the time when I started in the 80s through the 90s to now, you're talking, thousands and tens of thousands of dollars for a hound that's qualified for the truck hunt or a top competitor for super stakes or whatever it is. And that was all through the efforts of Jarvis and having that vision to take houndsman and coon hunting to the next level. And what a master plan to call that thing. Started out as a Professional Coon Hunters Association, later known as a Professional Kennel Club. That was genius.
Well, I think in the certainly in the coon dog world, it was the first one, I believe, PKC was the first one to have DNA testing.
For super stakes.
And obviously, breeding. When you're talking about stud dogs and that, boy, the old days before DNA, you're talking about a pig and a poke.
There's probably a reason why some of the other big supporters, I'm not saying the owners of those organizations, but big supporters didn't like PKC and their DNA profiling. There's if you started peeling back the layers of that onion, it's hard telling what you're going to find back in there behind some of those old hounds.
Yeah, I mean, they were ahead of the show dog world and everything else. And of course, I think that came because of Jarvis's familiarity with horses and cattle.
Right.
Right. You want, and from the standpoint of buying semen, that was very common with the horse world and the cattle world, but that was unheard of with dogs. I mean, I remember. I'll tell you what,
it's still hard to sell to houndsmen. They want a live cover. They're still thinking that that's the only way to breed, but that's another part of the puzzle that Jarvis brought to the coon hunting world was the DNA analysis and collecting and storing semen from some of these dogs. It's just that there's several pieces to this puzzle that we see that Jarvis and his vision were directly responsible for.
Absolutely. Once again, maybe the brainchild might have been Joyce whispering in his ear, and she just allowed Jarvis to get all the fanfare for it. But and Jarvis obviously, Jarvis was a smart man, and he knew how to coax the ideas from other people, and then put it into some type of a usable form.
Right.
And that was.
But in order to do that, to be able to have that ability, you've got to be a person that people believe in, they trust them. You give them these ideas and they know they're going to a good source. He had to have that trust among he had to be a good leader. He had to be an excellent leader.
Yeah. I would say, you say everybody that's reasonably successful, they're either a good leader or a good manager. I think Jarvis was much more of a great leader than he was a great manager. Jarvis left the managing and the detail to other people.
The people that he trusted.
He was always, he was the George Patton. He didn't say do this and do this and do this and I'll watch. He'd say follow me.
Right.
And I think the other thing that I think he was extremely successful at is there's a big step between an idea and a plan that can be put into action.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And whether it was something he dreamed up in the middle of the night as an idea, or he heard it somewhere else, or somebody else suggested it, or whatever, it came on a windstorm. Jarvis was exceptional at taking that idea and then conjuring up a plan that was usable.
Mm-hmm.
Because an idea is only an idea and it's only a dream unless it can be put into motion. And Jarvis would figure out some way to make it into something that worked.
Wow. Yeah. That's a great tribute. Well, we are going to have to wrap this one up. Have you got any final thoughts you want to wrap up about Jarvis or Joy Dog Food before we sign this thing off? We're going to hear from little Chip one last time.
I think, as I said, Jarvis, I considered him a true friend. I talked about the fact that what an innovator he was, but I think probably one of the biggest things, as I said before, would argue like brothers, but then would come up with something that worked and would stand shoulder to shoulder like brothers. And I think, at least from my standpoint, I might be small-minded, but from my perspective, and I know it was my dad's perspective before me, is you're willing to try almost anything with anybody, as long as when you put your shoulder to the wheel, the other guy's pushing on the other wheel just as hard. And when
that's kind of the way that's the same philosophy I use with the podcast, really.
Yeah. And and when you think about, and from I think something that was extremely attractive to us, I said the thing about Dad being excited about the fact he got to say the prayer at the opening exercise of the World Hunt. But when you had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people in that tennis center at Aurora, forget about their individual personalities, forget about their individual lifestyle. They stood up for the national anthem.
Right.
They took their hat off.
Yeah.
And they bowed their head when somebody prayed.
Mm-hmm. That says a lot about the character of houndsmen. Houndsmen are still today so patriotic, so faithful to, the I'm not going to say the simple things in life, but the important things in our world. They still have their eye on that prize. They can be we're a pragmatic group, but we also like to have principles in our life and stick to those principles. And I think that says a lot for Joy Dog Food and for you guys to be able, as a company and as a family, to be able to play a part in that just speaks volumes for you, Chip, and for your involvement in the youth and all the programs. So hats off to you.
Thanks for talking to you. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Chip, little Chip.
Yes, sir.
Hey, I want to thank you for setting this up. I sincerely enjoyed this conversation that I had with your dad. What a wealth of knowledge. So thank you for setting this up.
No problem at all. It's good to bring him out of retirement every now and again.
Man, I think we could have gone on for about 4 or 5 more hours and learned all sorts of things about dog food, the dog food industry. I know I didn't ask a lot of the questions I had, but and then the impact that Joy Dog Food had on competition coon hunting and what you guys are trying to do now. So I mean, you guys are still trying to you're jumping back in the game now.
Well, it's not like we're doing anything different. We're just following the footprint of what Dad and Grandpa did before us.
Right.
And starting it over again.
Right.
And I will jump back in for 1 second and remember the tie between Joy Dog Food then and Joy Dog Food today. That started with my dad finding some guy that had an old dog that was sleeping in a pup tent at the World Hunt and didn't have the money to get a motel room.
Wade graduates.
And Dad told him, he said, I'll get you a room. And Wade said, no, I'm okay where I'm at. And then Wade became a dog food customer.
Right.
Then he became a dog food dealer. And then he decided, well, he didn't want to just be Joy Dog Food, so he had to come up with his own brand. And eventually it went full circle. And for a while, he actually had to put up with me. But that was he probably views that as a very, very, very big blessing compared to putting up with my son. But I will say,
I guarantee it.
Chip will never be able to run a business the way I did, but he can sell stuff that I never could have sold. And I'm sure that's why Wade loves him.
Oh man. I'm not gonna let you have the final word, Chip. Little Chip.
That's fine.
Dad gets the final word on this one. Guys, I really appreciate your time this morning. It's been great, and thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, we're going to sign off with our tagline. Until next time, you follow your hounds and I'll follow mine.